Hello everyone, today we talk about politics and economy in two specific regions of Europe, Catalonia and Lombardy. Not much as a comparison, but really as examples of the reciprocal influence of the political and economical factor in the development of the local societies and institutions. And this is important because there is an ongoing debate that today we cannot touch, if not lightly and superficially, about the reconciliation from an historical point of view of the economical and political transformation around especially the so-called revival of the year 1000 that actually historians now have shifted at least 1 century one century before in its more widespread and properly kind of European dimension, especially in Western Europe, and that definitely had roots still in the 8th century. That is considered in many ways the moment in which the early medieval contraction had come to an end and things began to rise once again, at least in some of the most advanced regions of Europe, that Catalonia and Lombardy embody pretty well. And they're naturally very different territories with very different stories. And in here, the studies that have been led from this point of view, as far as I know, are mostly, in fact, socio-economical. That is, they definitely entail politics per se, but they also leave out a little bit the broader context of, and especially the military dynamics that went on in these areas, right? And these were quite troubled times. Today we'll look fundamentally from the 8th century to the 11th. So actually a moment of great transformation of conquest, because both these two European regions got conquered by the Carolingians, having previously very different characteristics, or at least especially from a political institutional point of view, and which were not easy events, right? They were not happy eventualities for the local communities. We often like to reason from the Carolingian perspective as the broader one, especially for Spain, in this anti-Muslim function. But if you really look at the route of Roncesvalles, who were the same Iberians actually fighting against the Franks, and considering also the blow that the Frankish invasions brought, like think about Italy, that was not an easy situation, but the region was able to recover and even to be incorporated by the Carolingians as an institutional reality, right? It was not recreated after the Carolingian conquest, but kept jealously with all the political and administrative structures that it had under the Longboard period. And two regions that also underwent from that point on, naturally, the decline of the Carolingian Empire, and suffering, if not properly the character of frontier state, which is definitely truer for Catalonia, though. For Italy it's a bit different, definitely underwent some important invasions or raids or however phenomenal, especially during the 10th century, inflicted pretty heavy blows to the two systems, and definitely also interfered with the process of political and institutional development. And this point of how did politics and economics interplay is definitely explainable through a much less categorical method, in fact, than simply saying, okay, was it economics that caused this, or was it politics, right? We can't, there is not just politics and there is not just economics per se. They're both expressive of a society, for example, and there is war as well, as we have stressed here. It's fascinating to observe, especially this European system that was gradually developing now from the 8th century with a similar base conferred, especially by the Frankish structures had been exported, and putting into relation what appears as a slower increase in population over these centuries, compared instead to transformation, for example, in the land exploitation, the agrarian structures, trade, right, and also the even and ever more rapid and violent one of the encastellation, the conflict between among powers, and also the establishment of the banal lordships. So these are all big chapters, and today we cannot cover definitely Catalonian and Lombard history just by saying, okay, let's see all these aspects in detail. So it's going to be fairly sketchy and just, simplistic overall. But this is just to spread awareness on these themes that triggered the debate around the revival of the year 1000, and that appears to be, in an academic perspective, also a fertile field of, at least of reflection, right? And this is important. It's especially important, I would say, to get rid of, as we were saying, just this mono trace paths, right? There are great historians that are definitely much more evolved, like intellectually, than this, compared to this simplistic approach. That, however, stressed, depending on their thesis based on different realities, the prevalence, or at least the greater importance of one, either the economical factor or the political factor, over the great changes of this age. For example, for Duby, the feudal mutation, that is, this transformation of the political structures, had a great impact on economy, right? Making emerging a new demand from the side of the banal lords, that in order to satisfy their needs, increased production. This is a very fascinating thesis, actually, and it's not even the most favored one, at least the one that's been used to explain most of the realities. And this is something that I tendentially agree with as a general perspective, because especially if you look at how rapidly political structures change in here, you must give it that if it is not strictly a political thing, right, it's not strictly ideal or visionary way of changing society. Definitely there were certain mechanisms that went far beyond the mere economical change, or at least that is naturally always there, is always intertwined, but that also is definitely not the only, nor the fast, nor the more powerful mover, right? And the idea now of feudalism in general as a great, actually, also effort, like I would say the structuralist theorists have always, for decades, somewhat also in Western historiography, has stressed the socio-economical approach as a excluding, in fact, the strictly political one, thinking that things change because it's just a change that happens from the bottom, right? But if you look at feudalism objectively, you gotta admit that this thing changed way too fast than just the same changes could trigger, right? Even if that they were actually the triggers by themselves, they were definitely not the greatest movers per se, right? So feudalism is a history of organization, of collective, of a social contract. It's not the history of an oppression or an exploitation, but if you want, the history of a lesser evil that was required, especially by the European societies during the 10th century, that saw an enormous deal of instability and insecurity, but that also had started to produce and to work in a way that now had to be organized in a more effective way to, if anything, to provide an answer from outer threats, but also to essentially accomplish a greater security at a local level, even just because of internal threats, right? Overall, I would say that the 10th century saw also the spread of encapsulation, not much just because of the so-called second invasions of the Vikings, of the Saracens, of the Hungers. Actually, the encapsulation is something that followed it, right? As sometimes even at the very end of those invasions, when the danger was past, and that is evidently rather more linked in many cases to the ambitions and also the availability of resources, and now could make lords building these local seigneuries and extending them as a private domain, and hence also towards the banal lordships were born, considering also in the meanwhile the general crisis of the of public authorities and central structures, if there were any. On the other hand, there is this, and which is the most pursued path. There's this idea that the economical conditions brought to the reasons of the feudal mutation, right? Just like in here we have said, it's still a matter of resources. It was, right? And Pierre Bonnassi, for example, that differently from the greater part of the French historians had at his disposal for his topic older sources than the 11th century, that, as you know, especially in northern France, is this great blooming of a lot of things, including documents, and who studied Catalonia, in fact, at the turn of the year 1000, came to the conclusion that it was especially the economical accumulation, the greater economical disposability that favored the rise of an aristocracy that was capable to undermine royal power and to provoke the birth of a seigneury. More recently, another very famous and particularly capable author, that is Chris Wickham, has proposed a new periodization, the merit of which consists in providing an interpretative model capable of evaluating comparatively different local experiences. And this is definitely the healthiest approach, always given that it's still very difficult to even follow the dichotomy, like it's either economy or politics per se. It probably doesn't even make sense as a question in some ways. But another problem is also that we know dramatically few of those realities, right? The sources are not yet, let's say, that they can't start being quantitative in the sense we know that a certain phenomenon was increasing, but we don't know by how much, right? And we can't really compare that easily, even on the base of the different sources, right? At least, it's not that it cannot be done, but it can be always very, very tricky, right? And I would say this is also this is something maybe you can do more easily for the very early Middle Ages, right? Now we are entering the high one, and the sources start being rather many, right, overall. So if you spend a lifetime studying early medieval Europe, I think at the end you will be able to have a fairly good idea of the wall, because sources are not so enormously much. So you can't cover a bibliography in a lifetime that deals with everything in those centuries. At this point, it's a bit more complicated, right? And it's still very easy to trick ourselves because we know so few that if you don't take one variable into adequate account, you may end up to express, apocalyptic judgments that, alter the whole thing. According to Wickham, around the end of the 8th century, and this is the in a nutshell his theory, Europe passed from, let's say, a social system on a peasant base, let's put it in these terms, in which the aristocratic intervention was absent, right, or almost at least, we're simplifying, of course, to a social system that was instead, in fact, oriented, at least in an aristocratic sense. And this is actually a fine judgment, according to me. Like, I'm no expert on the period, but objectively, from a military point of view, you can easily see this. You know, the increase of, for example, of an aristocratic, you know, warfare in some ways, the increasing importance of cavalry. And the same Carolingian world essentially does this. I mean, it's exporting now a much more highly stratified social system that, in fact, it establishes also in the various lands that the Franks conquered at that point. And this passage is, I mean, this is actually quite clear to ascertain. The point is realizing which were the causes, and especially how, you know, I wouldn't say necessary, because nothing is necessary per se, but let's say how much this could be effectively enacted, for example, by force, and how much was actually agreed but with the local communities, right? In the case, as we will see now, of Catalonia and of Lombardy are very fascinating, because they are two lands that if you want had it differently, even under the Carolingian rule, but still they kind of answered in a different way afterwards, in kind of diametrically opposed. And so, according to Wickham, before this transformation, society was fundamentally poor, right? Because there were essentially lots of peasants, generally also freer individually speaking, because you know that with the Vassalatic-Beneficiary structures, you also lose freedom as a peasant, and you get even poorer at a certain level, and the thing increases. The point is also, why do we pass to that? And this is a bit the debate of who had it better, like the early medieval peasant or the low medieval peasant, right? You know, the idea that that's being stressed, accusing feudalism of being this systematic oppressive system, which in part is true, of course, and at the point, however, that you would consider the early Middle Ages as a sort of paradise of freemen, where every freeman had his plot of land and hunted, was happy, and had this dramatically fat and protect diet, and everybody was happy, yay. Well, it rather seems that this is not the case. Generally speaking, with all the differences naturally that existed throughout Europe, as an Anglo-Saxon peasant was very different from a Longboard one, for example, and also very different from a Frankish one in that regard. But yes, maybe these people were not formally under much greater, very great constraints, but also they had pretty damn tough and hard life to cope with, because you don't take any plot of land and make it fertile and keep it fertile. You don't always have the means, in fact, to render that fertile. You don't really see the possibility of investing more than much in something different from that as a formula. And the fact that from between the 8th to the 11th century, you see this dramatic economical development of the whole continent, and in parallel you have essentially the rise of feudalism, should make us realize that aside from the parallelism between the centuries of different ages, is that overall society as a whole kind of improved, and quite dramatically so, right? The question is still why. And according to Wickham, the peasants in this previous phase were fundamentally not stimulated not even by taxes, right? They maintained themselves on the base of self-sufficiency, right? So not improving a great deal, not even associating more much, while the aristocrats that at this point had a lower asset, definitely on average, and therefore having at disposal just a relatively low land rent, right? They couldn't stimulate in their own turn the demand of handcraft products, nor trade, as a matter of fact. This is particularly evident, especially in pre-Carolingian Europe. Like if you take places like, in fact, especially I would say Anglo-Saxon England and Longboard Italy are very good ones, because after all, Gaul and Spain were more similar, right? Before the Muslim conquest, especially, you can see that the Visigoths were they weren't as socially stratified as the Franks, that already by the 5th century fundamentally found a Gallo-Roman society that was already, highly stratified, fundamentally still functioning on an estate level with all the resizing that had in time, but still valid as a formula. While in other areas of Europe, the freeman, right, was out there as a generally more, in fact, actually wealthier per capita individual, right? There is no doubt that, for example, Longboard Italy had a higher per capita wealth than Gaul, right? Even if Gaul was richer, actually. And the point was that the Frankish world was more socially stratified. It is already before the Carolingians, already before the reforms of Charles Martel. A lot of money were in the hands of a few people, right? With the Carolingian expansion, the Frankish model gets exported, even in lands that had not been quite like that. The idea also of the aristocracies is important here, because the Franks didn't have an aristocracy like the others. Like especially after the Carolingian reforms, the idea that this enormous amount of fiefs were in the hands of fewer people that had to provide with this professional military elite was unknown in systems like Britain, like Italy, like even in Spain, actually, at that level. And as a consequence, this system sometimes worked better than that we could expect. Like Anglo-Saxon England was dramatically fragmented because it had been conquered like in sparse ways. All these local monarchies had been struggling to create after the disruption actually of Roman Britain, because whatever happened even before the Anglo-Saxon conquest in Britain is unknown, but we can see was pretty damn bad, right? We know that all the terrain boundaries were all the properties were redrawn, basically, that something really bad happened there, and we don't know what exactly, but there was no institutional social continuity. They were the same people, but they had made essentially a sort of they had overthrown the elites in a way. Italy was very different, because Italy had naturally a greater Romanization. The Longobbards, contrarily to what is commonly believed, actually developed a hell of a kingdom. It was dramatically centralized, and that for sure was the most civilly advanced in all Western Europe before the Carolingian conquest, and kept actually being so for that reason. Where the kingdom was ruled from the cities that were that provided justice. The local dukes were literate. The king actually was involved in the highly involved in legal process. That there was a correspondence to the fact that the elites were poorer meant that they couldn't oppose the king. Right, the Longboard king had, on average, himself as the greatest landowner, actually less land that an average Frankish count had. Right, and as a consequence, the Longboard elite actually competed, but just within the let's say the space, the channel that was provided by the kingdom. That was usually urban power. That is rising within the ranks of the same royal administration to get control of these communities that were quite orderly and easily identifiable as the city that ruled the countryside all over Italy, with no exception. So it's obvious that this is also for a military history. Like, why did the Carolingians conquer half of Europe, literally, and reestablish the power that was unprecedented? since the Roman times, the late Roman times, and the question is that, of course, the Carolingians had a dramatically and I would say scholarly more advanced army than any other people in Europe, right? And this is basically the glory and pride and of the Franks as the most advanced thing they had ever created in that regard, right? There is nobody in Europe that has the same formula of the Carolingian armies, right? No people in Europe has a military class of professionals per se that basically rules the whole society. The rest of the world is a mix between this fairly weaker aristocracies and other freer communities that fundamentally balance their power, right? And this is not to say that, for example, a society like the Longboard one was less, was not stratified. For example, if you take, I don't know, Germany at the same time, even before, even during the Carolingian conquest, the Carolingian government for that matter, of course, I don't know, the Italians had much more robust aristocracies in that regard. They were much more stratified, and the same Carolingian conquest reinforced this dramatically, much more easily than it could be done in Germany, for that matter. That Germany would basically have to wait other, I would say, 400 years to come, let's say, to reimport fundamentally the Western Frankish model and make it work in their land. Actually, on the long run, it's paradoxically in Italy where it didn't quite work. Even in Spain, if you see, at the end of the day, well, Catalonia maybe it's an exception also with Aragon overall, but in Castile, for example, was the triumph of a feudal system that was of obvious Frankish influence, and that passed, in fact, through that social stratification. Not quite as in France, because Spanish, I don't know, cities or other, even peasant communities had a great weight, even in institutional balance, than in France. But they were still son of that, right? And we shouldn't be too categorical about this, because feudalism basically spread everywhere, right? It spread it was born in France, it spread in Italy, it spread in Spain, it spread in Germany, it spread in England, eventually, with all the either conquests or at least, let's say, emanations, I don't know, or radiations, let's say, of Frankish culture over time. The important to see there is also who was the concurrent, right? You can't say that the 12th century, I don't know, Italian feudatory is not living like, I don't know, a French one at that time. The point is that next door he had a city that was even more powerful than him, and that even, he was even obliged to pledge, allegiance, or even, to urbanize himself in order to live on. The picture here, according to Wickham, is therefore that when the elites transformed or were even created artificially at some point, especially during the Carolingian conquests, locally speaking, well, these began to intervene directly in the exploitation of the new lands, right? So this is important, because the process here is that the elite got in possession of those lands, right? Even if theoretically in the Frankish mindset it was just, king's property given temporarily, right? As we know, the thing turned into hereditary pretty damn fast, right? And this happened both in Catalonia and in Lombardy, and beyond. At a point, Catalonia, especially as the Spanish mark was basically transformed into a frontier province. Like there was actually a fairly central power in this regard. There were several counts ruling in the area on the dependency of the central authority. They all were milites. They were all knights, right? They owed military service. And castles were built as well as a frontier area. Like that was the choke point where the Carolingians counted on stemming the the Muslim invasions of Gaul, like it had happened during the same 8th century that the Spanish mark was established at the end, right? And it was a fairly successful experience, right? So much that the local counts of Catalonia, the central power proper, took so much taste of it that they even began to work as an autonomous power. That is, it didn't disgregate together with the Carolingian, like it was happening in Gaul, right next door, where the situation which was much more dramatic because the land was much more privatized since centuries, and what the Carolingians had done was just to pace, I don't know to say this specifically, but to remold the local properties, at least to put it in the hands of fewer people, so that it could be more directly controllable for the sake, in fact, of control proper, right? To say, okay, this is not a plethora, a multitude of people that we can't keep at bay, right? We at least have larger districts, and we can control them more easily, right? And one of the reasons why this system in Catalonia was so effective and it worked on, it was exactly because of the relative previous lack of privatization. Right, of course, there were aristocracies before the Carolingian times, and they also had taken probably a certain military nature overall, because Spain, for example, differently from Italy, was aside the Muslim invasion had created a mess, and especially the north was under this constant pressure and dealing with actually from the poorer areas that hadn't had much of a previous central administrations, like now that the Muslims could enjoy instead in the south, where incidentally though under Visigothic times the stratification was higher, right? And the north was fairly more we couldn't say egalitarian, I don't know how to say this, obviously in relation to times and places. So no pre-existing private clienteles of large dimensions that could counter central power. Well, the area remained under the public authority, under the count. Right? This is very, very interesting and very important. In Italy, in the Longboard Kingdom, well, the thing happened in a comparable way. Albeit the process took soon another path. Why? Because not, as we have seen before, not even in Italy the big clienteles actually exist. But when the Franks conquer it, they basically replicate this system there too. And this was, let's say, fairly easier in the north, in the Po Valley, in Lombardy proper. Right here by Lombardy, historically, we mean not the modern province in Italy, but the let's say the broader Po Valley area, including even areas like Piedmont up to the Euganian hills in the east, from which the Duchy of Friuli at that point began. In fact, that it underwent also a different history from Lombardy in that regard. The thing here developed with the creation of fiefdoms, right? That were definitely, however, remaining in standing with the urban administration, centralized administration, ruling from the cities as well, right? The Carolingian kings ruled from Pavia, the palace of Pavia, right? Think about the massive, solid urbanization of the Italian peninsula, even in the north, that in ancient times hadn't been much, prospering, that instead actually under Longboard times had developed dramatically. Also this strait with the east, passing in fact through the Po Valley and reaching Central Europe from there. So the situation was fairly balanced. What the Carolingians did in Italy was that they hoped to, yes, from one side affording always this private, clientelary, political and military system that could, however, coexist also with a minimal of, central government and administration, like they had founded when they had annexed the Longboard Kingdom. Remember that Charlemagne doesn't destroy the Longboard Kingdom. He becomes king of the Longobards himself, and he maintains standing all its institutions, and he even attaches the imperial title to Italy, because if you didn't take Italy first, you couldn't get to Rome to be crowned as emperor, right? So actually this broader area that was initially split, the Lotharingia plus Italy, basically. So this area of Central Europe between France and Germany today, more or less, and Italy was actually the most, prestigious area, right? The heartland of the Franks in the north, also with the capital Aachen in today's Germany. So the two capitals, and Rome in the south, and plus Pavia as another capital proper, right, with the Kingdom of Italy. And the history of Carolingian Italy is dramatically fascinating, because this was not like Catalonia, a small and peripheral entity. Italy was a freaking kingdom, right? And the Carolingian monarchs established themselves there, ruling it, right, as if they were from their home, right? There is no Carolingians ruling in the north. They literally go in northern Italy and they start ruling from the same place, right? The same goes for Western Francia and Eastern Francia, but Italy was, in many ways, the most successful one at that point, at least during the 9th century, because it was the system that managed to maintain a greater institutional cohesion that was unknown north of the Alps, because north of the Alps, the only thing that mattered were private clienterly ties, right? The world public power was fundamentally based on. In Italy, there was, as we've seen, a state proper, right? And the struggles of Carolingian Italy are mainly directed against the Saracens in the south of the peninsula, in fact, even clashing with the Byzantines for the influence on the area, right? The same Longobards before the Carolingian invasion had actually tried and almost succeeded to unify the whole peninsula. And after the Carolingian conquest in the south, the Lombard power had in part being preserved in the Apennine, but it was mostly the Byzantines, even in same alliance with the southern Longobards, to poor undisturbed, because in the meanwhile, like the Franks, yes, conquered Italy, but they stopped fundamentally at Rome, that they didn't annex, as the papacy was a very different thing in that regard, but Charlemagne tried to take Benevent, for example. They wanted, of course, to tighten the grip, but they had north of the Alps and even an enormous thing to control, right? It was enormously difficult to keep everyone at bay. The Saxons, the Aquitanians, the Longobards of the northeast, for example, rebelled as well at some point. Charlemagne had to go back and forth, right? There were also the Byzantine avamposts in Venetia and Istria, right? Charlemagne's son Pippin died actually in the siege of what would become Venice in the lagoons of Malaria. It wasn't an easy territory, right? And that's why we stress Lombardy here, because actually that was the core land of the Lombard Kingdom. It was well connected with Central Europe, and it even controlled substantially and directly Tuscany, that hadn't become the seat of any major power by itself under Lombard times. The local duchies had been fundamentally annexed to Lombardy as such. Northeastern Italy was different. It would even fall actually into Bavaria later on as a repartition. The central Italian lands, think about Spoleto, for example, were very difficult to control, right? They were across the Apennines in very difficult areas. For not talking, in fact, as we've seen before, about Benevent and the southern Longobards overall. So it was obvious and almost a mandatory choice for the Carolingians to rule from Lombardy, right? And that maintained, therefore, a certain, once again, a certain institutional continuity, right? If you think even about the Holy Roman Empire, refounded, let's say, improperly by Otto the Great. We made many videos about the Ottonians, and especially their relation with Italy, because it's basically what the whole imperial thing was based on. Italy remained the necessary reality that was needed for the German emperors to proclaim themselves as such, right? The Kingdom of Italy doesn't die out, right? It's something that dies out, that empties itself. It takes some time, actually, because the last Italian, or Italic, if you prefer, king was actually from the beginning of the 11th century. Then eventually it's the communes, the city-states, that take over, right? But otherwise, the Kingdom of Italy, as a distinct political institutional entity within the Holy Roman Empire, survived till the end, right, of the Holy Roman Empire itself. And it was the necessary one for many centuries to achieve the same imperial status, and also the necessary base from which to claim back the universality of the empire, because that was the next step to create a Mediterranean domain, right? And in the 12th century, at least, the Holy Roman Empire went very, very close to that. So the point is, when the Carolingians, however, die out, Italy reverts to let's say, not to a previous state, of course, but basically sees even in there this fragmentation into major aristocratic chunks, and mostly ruled from a, say, regional, or in English, let's say, provincial base. Think about the Mark of Ivrea, the Ascarian Mark, the one of Verona. Then also Tuscany will begin to acquire its own, per Mark is all that I mentioned, the Duchy of Spoleto, etc., and also these other territories in the middle between Venice and Rome, basically the Romagna, like it was called at the time, because it had been part of the Byzantine territory, begin to develop, in fact, their own aristocracies, right? This is especially happening at the end of the 9th century, the beginning of the 11th, before the arrival of the Ottonians. You find even properly Italian emperors that are appointed, because simply, I don't know, the Duchy of Spoleto could be crowned by the Pope nominally as emperor, right? And this thing is kind of weird, because it encompassed also a broader area than just Italy. Think about Provence, right? Southeastern France. Hugh of Provence comes to Italy. He seizes control even in Rome. I mean, there is all a very difficult situation. It is rendered even more difficult by the Saracen, but especially the Magyar incursions that even bring to the destruction of Pavia, of other important areas. And that meets in Italy fundamentally a fragmented situation, just like in the Vikings met it in France, or just like in Germany, for example. Even Catalonia actually suffers this, right? But it just as Italy, and this is something the two areas have in common, as most of this Western European world, is that these areas keep being rich, right? And this brings at the end of the 10th century even the Muslims to be worried of Catalonia, so much that they launched a devastating raid in the 80s. That definitely didn't help dramatically the situation, but the internal situation, and that was in fact probably one of the reasons of the same rise, as we'll see now, of the local aristocracies, in fact in a military defensive sense, right? In Italy the thing is a bit different, because there are these important Magyar raids, but overall the internal policy remains fundamentally connected to this competition between the various the various major feudatories that basically keep struggling against each other and start calling also someone from the outside. First it's Hug of Provence, also the Saxon intervention in there is triggered by the same Italian politics as such, and eventually what had been the Italic kingdom proper fundamentally is emptied by this gradual let's say, yeah, I would say disintegration of central power proper, right? Especially the extension of the Carolingian monarchy really brings to a decentralization even of the same command. Who are these kings of Italy appointed as such? They're just these local lords that get these titles, maybe even imperial one, but then come back ruling from their provincial base, right? In this dynamic, what Wickham has seen is that in the Pop Valley especially, the state created by the Carolingians that had, as we have seen, committed the aristocracies in management of power, because also the Carolingians couldn't really control Italy very easily, right? It will always be a problem because the area is too rich locally. So there is always someone rising with means that are difficult to find elsewhere, especially if you have to get all the way to Italy, across half of Europe to put down these rebellions, right? And it's these aristocrats proper, the same lords, that promoted the economical development, right? This is very important. This is very marked in Italy, that during the 10th century, these lords begin to build castles. And what do you think they do, actually? They preside themselves. Some of them, of course, they do, especially in their core land. But sometimes it happens they create castles to sell them, because there is a marketing here that, in spite of the Magyar, that way I was saying that the Magyars' invasions were not so disruptive, and probably Catalonia in this sense is that suffered more from the frontier area with Islam. There's various raids and counter raids that were typical even eventually of the Reconquista. An internal market that is flourishing on its own, right? And it's not just aristocrats that do this. It's those communities of merchants that we can find in the late, even quite clearly in the late Longboard legislation in the 8th century, that are actively building, trading, and expanding the markets, right, and making a living out of land market, right? They build, they sell, they buy, and Italy is also the most monetized area in Western Europe. The economy is more rampant. There is a much greater shift of capitals, right? And that's also possibly what creates not a difficulty to establish power domains. Think about the Canossa family, stretching from across central northern Italy, an immense power on their own. But let's say not being able on the long run, however, to make this something differently from an economical entity, and losing eventually on the same economical basis to the cities that now are, towards the 11th century, are beginning to rise at a point they can't be controlled that easily, right? These various local lords controlled, namely, since Carolingian times, on vassalatic account, the various cities. At a certain point, the cities begin to do on their own, right? And this is the greatness of this area, because this thing, for example, doesn't happen basically in any other place. Like the most similar reality is in fact southern France, a little bit the Occitan area, but not as nearly as this this intensive economical exploitation that starts taking place in the Pop Valley, especially. As, by the way, in these centuries, the best documented areas for especially agricultural expansion, etc., are northern France and northern Italy, because these are the most dynamic ones. Northern France has the larger assets, and the Lombards have the greater economical dynamism, and what happens in the latter is that, although of course there are these let's say more lower social status merchants that participate with great capitals to this business, it's the aristocracy that builds the economy, that lends to culture, that makes bonifications. They build castles, and they sell their products in the cities, and actually the great urban development of Italy during this point passes through the rural comital class of, in fact, the former, say, Carolingian or Carolingian appointed aristocracy, mixed with naturally with the Longboard one as well, that makes the traffics rise, right? And it begins really a transformation of the same landscape. And this is very interesting because, as you know, there is Italy, like for example, like Burgundy, fails as a kingdom, right? It remains there as a reality, while Burgundy will gradually vanish because, you know, the kingdom of Arles, as it was properly called, at one point becomes even a fiction in institutional terms. Italy will never come to that point, but the monarchy disappears, right? And here it's very difficult, in fact, not to bring in the equation the social organization. It's not just an economical thing, right? You can't say that as in Catalonia, as we'll see now, the Lombard lords will take over, because what will take over that has developed the economy and it was fairly rich actually is the city, right? That replaces the aristocracy, or incorporates it, or annexes it, or makes it urban as well, right? So this is even a step further in a kingdom that eventually passes in the hands of a broader domination, right? Because, in fact, after the revolts of the Italic nobility in the first 11th century that are crushed by Henry II, you don't find any other attempt to elect a local king. The thing remains fine, with the cities saying, okay, well, German emperors are out there north of the Alps, if they come just to second our business and to just get the crown in Rome, we second them as well. Whereas if they create problems, we'll fight them, but at the end of the day they will come back to Germany. That is very far from being a unitary monarchy, that have their own problems. So these people always will come back to Germany at some point, and we prefer to remain like this and essentially mind our own business as cities that, however, start doing also very, very strange things in a feudal perspective, that is ruling over the nobility of the countryside, and even swallowing other cities. That it is what actually will bring Barbarossa into Italy, as Milan was basically conquering all was around, and this neighboring center said, what the hell, let's call the official public authority, and that's how the thing began. But we are out of the timeline, right? So it seems really like in Italy it's the aristocracy that creates the economical development in this perspective. It's a simplistic interpretation, as we were saying in the beginning of the video, but it can't be interpreted effectively like this, because there is no other actor at that point that fundamentally leads at a local level this great entrepreneurial activity like the nobility does. In areas like Catalonia, instead, right, where the Carolingian count had kept away from power the local elites, right, something starts changing, especially from the 10th century, right, as the Catalonian elites basically increase in number, first of all, and in riches, right? There is an actual multiplication of the aristocracy, end of its power, right? That is connected to the broader economical growth of Catalonia per se, right? And this local aristocracy, what do? They fight and manage to eliminate the Carolingian count, right? By the beginning of the 11th century, this title was still there, but it was basically deprived of, even in there, of factual power. So that is fundamentally all these various counties that begin to rule on their own. And I think will have major consequences in Catalonian history, because as you know, and as we've made in those videos about the Spanish monarchies, you know, that this area of the Iberian Peninsula will develop a very, let's say, egalitarian institutional policy, right? Even the Kingdom of Aragon will have to always respect all the various local laws that had a much lower degree of centralization. Eventually, they will manage still to achieve a lot, because they had a lot of common interests, especially in the Mediterranean, therefore to expand, to conquer other lands outside, right? But at this point, there is definitely a failure of the central authority as such, right? And we can therefore say that in the case of Catalonia, instead, it was the economical growth to influence in a more, you know, imposing way, the political evolution, right? Because these people got richer seemingly for reasons that have few to do with the aristocracy itself, right? In Catalonia, it seems that the peasantry became richer overall, and that the local aristocracy began to basically subdue it and to get from it the power, the money, the resources that it required, even being able to hire, for example, mercenaries, even from the outside, to fight against central authority. In my opinion, even if I'm not completely sure of this, but it seems pretty evident, the frontier character of Catalonia, that is also fairly small, like it's mostly also the coastal areas. These are areas that, as you know, will eventually, you know, couple themselves with the Aragonese, you know, terrestrial power. But there is also in Catalonia definitely an important maritime development, or at this time there is a contact with the same Italian city-states. I mean, it's a process that will eventually link the Catalonia unavoidably to the Mediterranean as such, and they managed to crush this system that up to that point had held out, right? The Carolingian count was still a respected system, and that's what I wanted to say. Excuse me, is that the military element contributed surely to this. Like, even the idea that an Islamic power could arrive in this land and inflict a major blow to the local community, and the public authority couldn't counter it, right? Even, of course, having participated to the same, you know, military enterprises to, you know, to raid also in Muslim territory, etc. But, you know, that was considered by the you know, the fact, the same contractual nature of how feudalism developed as a failure of central authority. That is to say, you cannot help us, dispense us from, you know, this attack. Well, okay, so as privates, we will take once again the matter in our own hands, and we will defend ourselves the way we're pleased, right? And this is also the way, generally speaking, the rest of the you know, the feudal world developed like originally, right? It didn't start from the top, it started from the bottom, right? Unless after the disgregation of Carolingian power. And what is interesting about this ousting of the Carolingian count, of the old Carolingian count, let's say in the beginning of the 11th century, it wasn't no Carolingian anymore, but in Catalonia, is that the same Carolingian count at the time, in fairly recent times, under the reign, the Western Frankish reign of VIII Capet, had done exactly the same thing with with the Western Frankish king, because technically Catalonia belonged to the Western Frankish kingdom, and Hugh Capet required when he was elected king, as you know, with a very small base of power, but still the one that would evolve eventually in the French kingdom in its entirety, even at some point during the 13th century invading Catalonia for the same reasons that they thought it belonged to them, refused to be was not recognized by the Catalonian count. The Catalonian count said, you know what, you couldn't help us from the attack of the Muslims, so you're not my king, because a true king is legitimized only when is able to defend, right, the communities, the subjects. That's the first element, like this first duty of a king. If the king is not able to do that, we have to acknowledge that that's not a real power, right? And naturally, we're counting on the fact that we're pretty far away, that there were much more imposing vassals in France than the same French king at that point, and that's how they had said, okay, we will not recognize you. Well, that's what the local counts basically did in turn against, right? You can't maintain this unit, you can't rule the place, you can't defend it. We also discredit you, and we'll build our seigneuries on our own. And also at this period, actually, the Islamic power was gradually fading at some point, and the thing would evolve so that there was basically no way to reestablish a central authority that could contain the entrepreneuriality of this local lords that had all their business in frontier warfare per se, that they were not leaving anyone else partaking to it. This is an interesting perspective, I think, and there is maybe one connective thought to this, that is that in all these cases, the local societies that were formed were more diversified compared to the previous society at a peasant base that had been kept together by the Carolingians, right? They were, however, the ones that spread began the opposite model on the long run. So this is very important, because eventually all the major problems of rule in high medieval times would derive exactly from this. I mean, from the fact that the local societies were dynamic, were robust, were based on these local lordships that had developed in a functional sense to interact, to defend, and even to expand the same community. And there were lots of people investing in this expansion, and that's what properly brought to the redefinition of power per se, the creation of new political entities, and new political institutional models. Think about the Italian communes as such, that even in Spain, even Spain had its own important city powers, especially in these areas. Catalonia was importantly Romanized. Also, the Ebro Valley in general, in the hinterland, was always rebelling back in the day to the Visigothic kingdom that was shifted basically towards the south. It was more like, in anachronistic terms, what would be a Castilian power. Also, more shifted even towards the south, for more fertile area too. And they were also culturally different. I mean, they had different wealth distribution. For example, they had they were simply connected to another. To look at the watersheds of Spain, I mean, they were connected towards other theaters, right? It's obvious that the Ebro Valley, that Catalonia have this greater interest towards the Mediterranean, towards southern France, right? Towards this outer world, while the Spanish hinterland is more focused within itself, right? And it has several boundaries to pass in order to get to that reality, right? Because they have the same Aragon and the same Pyrenees that stop that in a way. So, and I think it's fascinating to compare these realities and to observe how probably this dichotomy between politics and economics is probably similar, especially in these areas of Europe, like in the south, like Catalonia and Italy could be. They're not like the same thing. They are different, but they also share something in common, like a greater urbanization, for example, a more central rule, right? And they yet acquire, they grow economically, but they also transform in different societies, right? And this has a lot to do even with the different size, different pre-existing governments, and also different, different neighbors, definitely, and different institutional frames, right? The Holy Roman Empire is important. I just think if, I don't know, if the Ottonians had not revived the empire, well, who knows how Italy would have evolved? Maybe a monarchy would have emerged, still from the ashes of the Longboard one, in that Lombard base. Instead, this didn't happen. It was crushed, right, by blows of the same Ottonians. The same goes for Catalonia. What if it hadn't been so, peripheral? What if it had, even just from the important centers of power, but also from that specific geographic location, the access to the sea, the position towards the between France, between Muslim Spain. These are all factors that played an important role to shape the societies in a different way. Right, the impression, in fact, is that after all, even if Catalonia always passes from for European standards during the Middle Ages as a land of rich merchants, traders, etc., Catalonia still has a fairly, in fact, Frankish, chivalric character. Right, it's more neatly shaped, as separated internally between what is more like the city per se and the nobility per se in the rural area. Let's say there is, I don't know how to say, the feudal element, say better, in the rural area. In Lombardy, this thing gets basically blended. Yes, towards the Alpine areas there are a bit more of aristocrats in that sense, but in the overwhelming center of the thing is the Povalla as such, and in there you see that the nobility, the feudal element, transforms itself into a urban element, right? They are same aristocracy, they're the same knights, the same chivalry culture, but they live in the city, and their families do also very different things, right? Those who are not this extended clans, just knights, and this will change a lot, even in the respective military, the respective warfare, for example. It's very fascinating to observe. Anyhow, I think for today we can stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. Therefore, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.